Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Pastor Brian. Good to see everybody this morning. Did you get your balloon on the way in today? If you did not, raise your hand. We'll make sure you're going to need it in just a few minutes. Balloon. Anybody else? I kind of have other things to do. Jesse, could you help make sure these balloons get passed out? Just keep your hands up. Everybody needs a balloon this morning. The balloons have something to do with this creative mess that you see up here that's been up here for weeks, that's been part of this message series that we're closing out today called Drawn In, Living the Creative Life with God. And we've been thinking about God as being creative and that we join God in that creative act of making the world a better place in all the different ways that we do it. We've been talking about steps of creativity that we might engage with with God, and those steps have been dreaming with God, hovering with God, connecting, risking, listening. Last week we talked about reintegrating, about bringing brokenness in the world back together into a whole. And today we finally arrive at the last step in the creative process, which is rest. Rest. And our text today comes from the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 20. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So a quick quiz for you this morning. By a show of hands, how many of you right now could name all of the 10 Commandments for me? Don't worry, I can't do it either. But we know all the important ones, right? By the way, I've noticed that people that insist, particularly government officials that insist we post the 10 Commandments in government buildings on public property, I bet if you asked them, they couldn't tell you what all 10 of them are either. But as I said, we know the important ones. Don't lie, don't steal, don't murder, honor your mother and father, honor God, keep the Sabbath. Well, wait a minute. You know, there is one in that list of 9 that we don't follow too well. There's about 9 of them we follow. Most of us can follow them without any trouble. But there is one that was just mentioned in the list that we, if we're really honest, we have trouble following and sticking to. It is the one that says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, why should that be the hardest one for us to follow? It's the easiest one, isn't it? It's the one that says, take a day off. Stop working for a while. Rest a little bit. Enjoy life. Take some time off to play and have fun. And yet that's the one that most of us have trouble really following on any regular basis. Some of you here are old enough, like me, to remember a time in the United States when almost every state had what they called blue laws. We were talking about this in the adult class this morning. How many of you remember the blue laws? So these were these laws that said that certain businesses couldn't do work on Sunday. Not all, but most. But the cultural effect of the blue laws was that when I was a child, almost everything, every business was closed on Sunday, which meant my memory as a kid is you couldn't go to the mall and go shopping. You couldn't go to the video arcade back when we had those. You couldn't go see a movie on Sunday. You couldn't buy liquor on Sunday. Not that I was buying liquor as a child on Sunday, but that's my memory, that you couldn't do any of those things. And the idea of it was then that you would go to church and go home and spend time with your family because there wasn't anything else to do on a Sunday. And I think it was meant to give you some freedom just to do those two things. But I'll have to tell you, at least as a child back in those days, it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like we were being restricted, right? It felt like we were being punished. It was a way of saying all the fun things you want to do on a Sunday, you don't get to do. Well, thank goodness we got rid of those blue laws, right? Now we're free to do whatever we want to do. We're free to do whatever we want to do on Sunday or any other day of the week. And so things are much better, right? Yeah, I hear that groan. Let me just lay a couple of statistics on you here. In any given year, Americans leave over 400 million vacation hours unused. At least 40% of Americans, we're told, do not get enough sleep because we're too busy. At least 40% of Americans admit that when they're on vacation, they at least look at or answer emails from work, and even more say they look at emails at home when they're in bed. We know that on average that Americans work longer hours, take less vacation, and retire later than any other industrialized nation. And in the most recent World Happiness Report, yes, there is such a thing, that rates countries on such measures as income and sense of freedom and access to social supports and health into later years, we rank 19th on that list, behind countries like Sweden and Norway and the Netherlands and even the UK and Germany. And actually in the last few years, we've been dropping on that list of happiest countries in the world. So we have all this freedom, but it doesn't appear that we're any happier, any more rested as a people. In a way, I'd argue that we sort of exchanged in our culture the restriction of the blue laws for the restriction of overwork, for the restriction of being too busy, the restriction of how we're always feeling like we got to go all the time. I will say this morning that we've exchanged the restriction of those blue laws for the restriction of brick making. Did you hear that? Brick making. Now, for that phrase to make sense to you, I've got to dig back into the Hebrew Scriptures. I've got to go back to the first story that the Hebrew people told themselves, their foundational story. And I'm not talking about Genesis. I'm not talking about the creation stories. I'm not talking about Adam and Eve. I'm talking about their first story, the story that they told themselves that really defined who they'd be as a people, the story of being slaves in Egypt, the story of the Exodus, of this God Yahweh who comes to them and says, I'm going to bring you out of slavery so you can rest. You see, the Hebrew people were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and what was their job as slaves? They were to make the bricks. Pharaoh had what he called supply cities, cities that were built simply to hold his wealth. In order to build these cities, they had needed bricks. And these cities were used, think of a more menacing Scrooge McDuck. He needed all these cities just to pile his wealth into, and his wealth was what? It was grain. It was in the form of grain. He had to store it somewhere, and he was always getting more and more. And so the people had to make him bricks. And they had to literally make the bricks. They had to get dirt, they had to get clay, they had to get straw, and make the bricks. Make some bricks with me. Make some bricks. There you go. Yeah. So we're making bricks, and they had to keep making bricks. Don't stop. We have to keep making bricks because Pharaoh's got more and more grain that has to be put somewhere, so we have to keep making bricks, and there's no rest. Some of you are trying to get out of it, but you couldn't get out of it if you're a Hebrew slave. You have to just keep making the bricks. There was no stop. You don't stop. As far as we know, Pharaoh doesn't stop because Pharaoh has to keep an eye on all of you to make sure you keep making the bricks. There is no rest. As far as Pharaoh was concerned, if you were the Hebrew slave, your only value is a commodity. Your only value is your ability to keep making bricks. And even when your friend Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, can you give the people a break? What does the Pharaoh do? He says, no, I'm not going to give you a break. And in fact, I'm going to make it harder. And so he takes the straw away and says, you can't use my straw anymore to make bricks. You got to go find your own, but you have to make just as many bricks. Keep making the bricks. And then into this story, into this ancient narrative comes this God, Yahweh. And this God is not like all the other gods of the Egyptian world, because all the other gods of the Egyptian world were focused on serving the needs of the elites and the wealthy. And we don't know why, but for some reason they tell this story that this God, Yahweh, cares most about the slaves, cares most about the poor, cares most about the people at the bottom of the rungs. And this God steps in and says, I don't know about this Pharaoh, but I take a rest. I am a Sabbath-keeping God. As Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, says, the God we worship is not a workaholic. And this God says, your value is not in your ability to be a commodity for the empire. Your value is not in your ability to keep making bricks. It's not in what you do. It's who you are. And who you are, I invite you to be people in covenant with me, loving covenant. That's who you are. That's your value, is simply being with me in this loving covenant relationship. And I take a rest, and so you should take a rest. It's a great idea, isn't it? to be Sabbath-keeping people with a Sabbath-keeping God. And it went well for a long time, apparently. They kept the Sabbath. They took a day off and they rested, and they didn't say it was just for us. It should be for everybody. Our animals should get to rest. Our servants should get to rest. All the people around us, we should offer them a chance to rest, to be Sabbath-keeping people. And apparently it worked for a while, but as people are, we tend to mess things up. And by the time we get to the first century, by the time to Jesus, the time of the writing of the New Testament, the Jewish people have developed, because this is what we like to do as people, a bunch of rules about Sabbath, right? There was some 37 plus rules about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath, what work was forbidden and work you could do, and they were really sticklers about it. And even though these rules didn't really come down from high by God, the people, most of them treated them as if they did come from God, and they were very strict about following these rules about Sabbath keeping. And then, much like Yahweh coming into the ancient narrative, here comes Jesus into this later narrative, and Jesus has a different understanding of Sabbath. One day Jesus is walking through the fields of wheat with his disciples, and they're hungry, they're starving to death, and they start breaking off the heads of the grain and crushing it and eating it. And when the religious elites hear about this, they say, wait a minute. That's harvesting. That's working. On the Sabbath, you broke the rules of Sabbath. And then later, when we have stories of Jesus healing people who are sick on the Sabbath, again, the religious elites say, wait a minute, that's breaking the rules of the Sabbath. You're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus, in essence, says to them, hey guys, you're a little confused about this Sabbath thing. You know? People weren't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to serve the people. Jesus says to them all, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. You're supposed to have abundant life, not a restricted life. Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are weary and overburdened, and I'll give you rest. Any of you here this morning who consider yourself creative people, maybe by now I'd hope after weeks and weeks of this message series you realize we're all creative people in one way or another. But those of you who create, those of you who are painters or sculptors or quilters, or maybe you build things with hammers and nails, maybe you compose music, maybe you're an actor rehearsing a play, you know that at some point in the creative process you have to step back. You have to pause and take a break, or else the creative process becomes more of a chore, a job that you're doing, and the work suffers. You have to step back for a while and take a pause. And so I'm arguing today that if we're all people involved in God's creative process of making the world a better place, in whatever way you're doing that, in your job, and your volunteering, the way you're raising your family, and how you treat your friends and things you do out in the community, whatever we're doing in the creative process with God, there does come a time when we have to step back and pause and rest. We have to acknowledge to ourselves that the world will keep on spinning without us if we take a real break, if we really pause. That our value for God is not in our brick making. It's not in being always busy, always proving that we're doing something productive, always finding something to keep our time occupied, that sometimes our value isn't simply just being. And Walter Brueggemann, who I mentioned, the Old Testament scholar, says that we are people, as people of faith, that live in a tension between two different scripts within the culture that we're in. One script is the script of the empire we live in. We live in a brick-making empire. We do. And our empire still today tells us your value is in keeping busy, keeping productive, producing something. And over here is the script of Jesus and God that says, no, your value isn't simply that you are and that you're loved. And Brueggemann says we have a choice which of those scripts we will follow. But he warns us, if you choose in a brick-making empire to follow Sabbath-keeping, that's a radical act. In fact, that's an act of resistance against the empire. To just take a break. So what do you need Sabbath from today? Think about your life, all the stuff you're going through, all the things you have to do, all the things that are on your to-do list for today and tomorrow and the rest of the week, all the things people are expecting out of you. What do you most need rest from in your life today? I mean real rest. And what would it mean for you to see Sabbath for yourself not as a restriction? Oh gosh, I got to go to church today, or oh gosh, we can't go out and do anything, we just have to stay at home. What would it mean for you to see that not as a restriction, but as a gift? A gift to just simply pause and rest. And can you imagine if we just sat once in a while and we just be instead of do? And let me take this just a step further. The reason this is so important for people like us, people of faith, to take Sabbath, to be Sabbath-keeping people, part of it's for us. We need the break. But part of it also is because we should desire Sabbath for others as well. And it's in our own Sabbath-keeping we're much more likely to see opportunities to help others find Sabbath too, as an act of justice. As an act of justice to say there are people in our neighborhood right here around this church, in our community, in wider places, who need Sabbath from what? They need Sabbath from poverty. They need Sabbath from hunger. There are people around us that need Sabbath from loneliness. There are people who need sacred Sabbath rest from being marginalized. People who need Sabbath from prejudice. People who need Sabbath from just not feeling like they belong. And we're called to help bring Sabbath to them as well. I want to close today by arguing that maybe the one thing I think that everybody here needs Sabbath from, and probably everybody out there needs Sabbath from, maybe more than anything else right now, is Sabbath from seriousness. We live in a world that there's serious stuff going on out there in our country and beyond. And if you want to focus on it all the time, you can, but boy, it brings you down, doesn't it? We have to be so serious all the time. And here's Jesus saying, but remember, I came to bring you life and bring it abundantly. Life is supposed to have joy in it. It's supposed to have fun in it. You can't be serious all the time. You have to take a break from all of that. And I think that includes being in worship. We come together to be in a time that we enjoy each other. We're just being together right now. We're just resting together right now. And sometimes worship doesn't have to be so serious. Amen? Sometimes worship should be fun because we are part of a Sabbath-keeping God who takes a rest and has fun. So, we began this message series weeks ago with a creative act of performance art. Do you remember that? Those of you that were here, everybody had colored paper and you got to throw it all up here, right? It was kind of this act of creative chaos we were talking about. So I thought it's appropriate that we end this series with a piece of creative performance art. So now you're going to need your balloon. And I gave my balloon away. Were there any extra? I want to call this piece of performance art Releasing the Sabbath-Keeping Spirit of God. All right? So you do need to blow up your balloon. Do not tie it, and don't let it get away. There might be somebody next to you that this is not easy to blow up a balloon, so help them blow it up. Okay, so we're calling this piece of performance art Releasing the Sabbath-Keeping Spirit of God. And like any good creative act, we get it started, but in a real good creative moment, we have to step back, like in Sabbath. We have to just let it be what it's going to be. We let go of control, let God's Spirit take over, and we see what we create together. Maybe a moment of fun in worship. Sacred fun, I will argue. All right, so are you ready? We're going to create Releasing the Sabbath-Keeping Spirit of God. On 3, let your balloons go.
Yeah.
And all the people say,
Amen.
and since we're really serious about this Sabbath keeping and rest today, I don't know who's going to clean those up, but it's not going to be any of us, right? Amen? Let's pray together. Sabbath-keeping God, we hear today that you invite us into a life that is meant to be enjoyed, that's meant to be abundant, that it's okay in your presence to have fun, to celebrate. And so we invite you into our hearts today to help us be more like that, not just in this moment, but as we leave here, that we go out into a very, very serious world. Help us to be Sabbath keepers. Help us to offer Sabbath to people in the ways that we can, to help them find the sort of rest they need in their lives so that they can just be with you. They can just know the truth that we know, the truth we found in our brother Jesus, that you love us more than we will ever know. Help us rest in that truth. Help us be re-energized by that truth. Help us rest in you. Amen. Let us rise in body or spirit now and sing together.